November 1942, North Africa. The dust was so thick Hauptmann Klaus Weber could taste it between his teeth as he watched three small American vehicles bounce across the rocky desert toward his position, their thin bodies rattling and shaking like toys about to fall apart. He'd been fighting in Africa for 18 months, and his Kübelwagen had proven reliable in the brutal conditions, engineered with German precision and built to last through anything the desert could throw at it. These American machines looked like they'd been assembled from scrap metal and prayers, their hoods barely thicker than cardboard, their frames so light he figured a good strong wind might flip them over and send them tumbling across the sand. Weber turned to his sergeant and laughed, actually laughed out loud, because the idea that these tin cans were supposed to be military vehicles seemed like an insult to the very concept of German engineering that had dominated European battlefields for 3 straight years. His sergeant joined in the laughter, making jokes about American industrial incompetence and wondering if the vehicles were made from recycled food cans. But what Weber didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand as he watched those jeeps approach through the desert heat and swirling sand, was that he was looking at the vehicle that would help win the war and change military logistics forever. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button because we're diving deep into one of the most underestimated pieces of equipment in World War II. And trust me, the numbers and stories behind this vehicle are absolutely insane and will change how you think about what actually wins wars. What Klaus Weber was mocking that day in the North African desert was the Willys MB Jeep, and within the next 3 years, this supposedly fragile little vehicle would prove more reliable, more versatile, and more unstoppable than anything the Germans could build. This is the story of how a vehicle the enemy called a tin can on wheels survived everything the Axis threw at it, became the backbone of Allied victory, and earned the respect of every soldier who ever sat behind its wheel. The Germans had every reason to feel confident about their vehicles because they'd spent the entire 1930s perfecting military automotive design, pouring millions of Reichsmarks into research and development, creating machines that were over-engineered, heavily built, and designed to handle the absolute worst conditions that Europe, North Africa, and Russia could possibly offer. The Kübelwagen cost over $1,000 to produce, featured advanced engineering with sophisticated suspension systems, and German tankers and infantry had relied on these vehicles to blitz through Poland in 27 days, crush France in 6 weeks, and punch deep into Russia in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. German military doctrine was built around a philosophy of quality over quantity, the deeply held belief that superior engineering and craftsmanship would always beat mass production and cheap construction. And for the first 3 years of the war, that philosophy had seemed absolutely unbeatable. Every battle, every campaign, every victory seemed to prove that German technical superiority was a real and decisive advantage. But the Americans were playing a completely different game, one the Germans didn't understand until it was far too late to adapt. The Willys MB Jeep cost $738 to build, almost 30% less than a Kübelwagen, and American factories were cranking them out so fast the production numbers seemed physically impossible by German standards. Ford and Willys combined were producing one complete Jeep every 90 seconds, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with assembly lines that never stopped running and workers rotating through 3 shifts to keep the vehicles rolling out the factory doors. By the time the assembly lines finally stopped in 1945, they'd built over 640,000 of these vehicles, more military vehicles than Germany, Italy, and Japan had produced combined during the entire war. The Germans looked at these specs and production numbers and saw what they thought was proof of American industrial sloppiness and a focus on cheap construction designed purely for quantity instead of quality. Vehicles that would break down after a few thousand miles of hard use and leave American units stranded in the field. They believed these Jeeps were disposable, meant to be used once and thrown away because America had so many resources they didn't care about waste. They were catastrophically, devastatingly wrong about everything. The first real shock came in North Africa during the Tunisia campaign when German mechanics got their hands on a captured Jeep and tore it completely apart to understand what they were actually facing and what made these vehicles perform the way field reports claimed. What they found genuinely confused them because the design made absolutely no sense according to traditional German engineering wisdom and the principles they'd been taught in technical schools. The Jeep was light, ridiculously light, barely 2,400 pounds compared to the Kübelwagen's 3,000 pounds, with a frame that looked like it couldn't handle serious abuse and body panels so thin you could literally dent them with your fist if you hit hard enough. The engine was a simple 4-cylinder design with only 60 horsepower. Nothing special, nothing impressive, just a basic motor that seemed underpowered for military use. The transmission was straightforward. The axles were basic. The entire vehicle screamed simplicity over sophistication. But when they actually tested it, when German drivers took it out into the same brutal North African conditions that wore down their carefully engineered Kübelwagens, something completely impossible happened that contradicted everything they thought they knew. The Jeep kept running. It bounced over rocks and boulders that should have shattered its axles and torn its suspension apart. It powered through deep sand that should have buried its wheels and left it stuck until a recovery vehicle could pull it out. It climbed slopes so steep the German drivers genuinely thought they were going to flip backward and roll down the hill. And when they finally pushed it to what should have been complete mechanical failure, the little 4-cylinder engine just kept humming along like it was designed for exactly this kind of brutal punishment and abuse. American commanders were using Jeeps in ways that would have been considered absolutely insane and reckless by German military standards, and the vehicles just kept performing beyond any reasonable expectation. They were being airdropped from cargo planes flying at 800 feet, tumbling out of the sky in padded wooden crates that would have destroyed most vehicles on impact. But the Jeeps landed hard in fields behind enemy lines, got unpacked by paratroopers, and drove away within minutes like nothing had happened. Combat engineers were driving them underwater through rivers and streams during amphibious operations, the water coming up past the hood and over the windshield, and the engines kept firing because the ignition systems were completely sealed and waterproofed for exactly this purpose. Soldiers were loading these supposedly fragile vehicles with twice their rated capacity, stacking them with ammunition boxes, weapons, wounded men, and supplies until the suspension compressed almost flat and the tires bulged under the weight. And they'd drive for hours across terrain that had no roads, no paths, no infrastructure of any kind, just raw earth and rocks and mud and whatever obstacles nature put in their way. The Jeeps handled absolutely all of it without complaining. The maintenance records told a story that German logistics officers found genuinely disturbing and almost unbelievable when they captured American supplied documents and repair logs during the Battle of the Bulge. Kübelwagens needed specialized tools that only trained mechanics possessed, required specific replacement parts that had to be ordered through complex supply chains, and demanded regular maintenance intervals that required taking vehicles completely out of service for hours or even days at a time while technicians performed detailed inspections. Jeeps could be fixed with basic tools that any soldier carried in the field, often by men who had no formal mechanical training whatsoever beyond what they'd learned working on tractors back on their family farms. And they required maintenance so rarely that some units were reporting vehicles running for weeks straight without needing anything more than fuel and oil changes. One particular Jeep in the Pacific Theater, documented in Marine Corps records, logged over 50,000 miles of combat use across multiple island campaigns, getting shot up by Japanese fire, repaired with salvaged parts from destroyed vehicles, hit by shrapnel, patched with whatever materials soldiers could find, and put back into service over and over again until the frame was more patches and welds than original metal. And it was still running when Japan surrendered in August 1945. But the real genius of the Jeep wasn't just mechanical reliability. It was the incredible versatility that allowed it to perform dozens of different roles that military planners had assumed would require specialized vehicles. In North Africa, Jeeps mounted with Browning 50 caliber machine guns became fast-moving cavalry scouts that could outrun German patrols and hit supply convoys before disappearing into the desert. In Italy, they carried wounded soldiers down mountain roads so narrow that ambulances couldn't navigate them, bouncing over rocks and through streams while medics held plasma bottles and tried to keep injured men stable. In France after D-Day, forward artillery observers used Jeeps equipped with radios to call in fire missions, racing ahead of advancing infantry to spot German positions and direct devastating bombardments. In the Pacific, Marines drove Jeeps through jungles where no vehicle should have been able to go, cutting paths through vegetation and fording rivers to establish supply lines to frontline units fighting in some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The vehicle adapted to whatever role soldiers needed it to fill, and it never failed to deliver. By late 1943, German intelligence reports about American logistics were starting to sound almost panicked because every analysis, every captured document, every field observation showed the same impossible pattern that shouldn't have been sustainable. American units were moving faster than German forces despite having longer supply lines, responding quicker to developing situations even when they were farther from their bases, and maintaining supply chains that should have been too stretched and too vulnerable to function effectively in combat conditions. And the reason was always exactly the same. Jeeps were everywhere, absolutely everywhere, doing everything imaginable, carrying radios for forward observers who directed naval gunfire, mounting machine guns for cavalry reconnaissance patrols that probed enemy defenses, towing artillery pieces through mud that trapped heavier vehicles and left them stuck, evacuating wounded from battlefields under direct fire while medics worked to save lives in moving vehicles, and performing dozens of other critical roles that no single vehicle should have been capable of handling effectively. A captured German intelligence report from the Eastern Front, written after Lend-Lease Jeeps started arriving in Soviet hands by the thousands, described American automotive production as a form of strategic weapon more effective than any tank or airplane because it gave Allied forces a fundamental mobility advantage that couldn't be countered through tactics or training. Soviet commanders fell in love with the Jeep immediately and completely, often preferring it to their own vehicles despite having never asked for American help with automotive design. Marshal Zhukov, who commanded Soviet forces in some of the most critical battles of the Eastern Front, later wrote in his memoirs that the Jeep was one of the most important weapons America sent to Russia, more valuable in many ways than the thousands of tanks and aircraft that got more attention. Soviet soldiers nicknamed it the Willys and used it for everything from reconnaissance to ambulance duty to mounting captured German weapons. The vehicle's simplicity meant that Soviet mechanics, working in freezing conditions with limited tools, could keep them running through Russian winters that routinely destroyed more sophisticated equipment. German troops on the Eastern Front reported with frustration that Soviet units equipped with American Jeeps were suddenly moving with a speed and flexibility that Soviet trucks had never provided, making it harder to predict enemy movements and easier for the Red Army to exploit breakthroughs. In the Pacific, the Jeep faced challenges that designers in Ohio could never have imagined when they created it. Islands with volcanic sand that acted like ball bearings under tires, humidity so intense that it rusted metal overnight, tropical diseases that affected soldiers but somehow the Jeeps kept running, and Japanese artillery that specifically targeted any vehicle because they represented American mobility and logistics superiority. Marines drove Jeeps up jungle mountains, through rivers filled with hidden obstacles, across beaches under fire, and into combat zones where they mounted recoilless rifles and used them as mobile fire support platforms. One famous photograph from Iwo Jima shows a Jeep with bullet holes in every panel, its windshield shattered, one tire flat, still being driven by a Marine who needed to get ammunition to a forward position because stopping wasn't an option when your brothers were fighting and dying 50 yards ahead. The versatility reached almost absurd levels as soldiers found new uses the designers never intended. Jeeps pulled gliders at airfields, pumped water for field hospitals, generated electricity for command posts, carried mail to isolated units, transported VIPs including generals and even President Roosevelt, served as mobile weather stations, carried wounded dogs from Marine War dog platoons, towed disabled aircraft on airfields, and in one documented case in France, a Jeep was modified to carry and fire captured German Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons because American soldiers figured if it worked for the Germans, it would work for them too. The vehicle became whatever the mission required it to be. The numbers by 1945 were absolutely crushing and told a story of industrial dominance that Germany simply could not match or counter. American factories had built over 640,000 Jeeps while Germany had produced around 50,000 Kübelwagens for the entire 6 years of war. Even more devastating, those Jeeps were still running after 4 years of brutal combat while German vehicles were breaking down from chronic parts shortages, normal wear and tear, and the simple fact that their complex engineering required resources and manufacturing capacity that Germany no longer possessed. Allied bombing had destroyed German factories, supply lines were collapsing, and the sophisticated vehicles that had worked perfectly in 1940 were becoming impossible to maintain by 1945. Meanwhile, some Jeeps that rolled off assembly lines in 1942 were still in active service when Germany surrendered, still functional, still reliable, still doing their jobs after surviving conditions that should have destroyed them 100 times over. The contrast couldn't have been more stark or more decisive. Klaus Weber survived the war, returned to Germany, and eventually wrote his memoirs 20 years later when enough time had passed that he could be honest about what he'd seen and what it meant. In those pages, he admitted that the moment he laughed at those American Jeeps in the North African desert was the exact moment he should have realized Germany was going to lose the war. Not because of the vehicles themselves, but because of what they represented at a fundamental level. American industry could build hundreds of thousands of simple, reliable machines faster than Germany could destroy them, and that crude tin can on wheels he'd mocked with such confidence had more strategic value than the most perfectly engineered German vehicle because it actually worked when you needed it to work, every single time, without fail, in any condition, anywhere in the world. Weber wrote that German engineering had been too focused on making things perfect and not focused enough on making things that worked everywhere and never stopped working, and that difference had cost them everything. The Willys MB Jeep wasn't the most advanced vehicle of World War II, wasn't the fastest or the most powerful or the most heavily armored or the most impressive to look at, but it might have been the single most important piece of equipment the Allies produced because it gave American, British, Soviet, and Free French forces something the Axis could never match or even understand: the ability to be everywhere simultaneously, do everything required, and keep moving forward no matter what obstacles the enemy or nature put in the way. And here's something that proves just how good the design was. Some of those original World War II Jeeps are still running today, 8 decades later, still being driven by collectors and enthusiasts and veterans who refuse to let them die. Still proving that sometimes the best engineering isn't about perfection or sophistication. It's about building something simple that actually works under any condition and never lets you down when lives depend on it. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the Jeep that won World War II and changed how armies think about mobility forever. Next week, we're covering the German tank crew that faced 7 to 6 American Shermans with just 5 Panthers and discovered their superior armor meant absolutely nothing against impossible numbers and American industrial might. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and we'll see you in the next one from WW2 Vault.